Well, today in this episode, we're going to talk about an engine that Pontiac introduced in the mid-1960s, specifically in 1966, and that is its overhead cam six-cylinder engine. Now, the 1966 to 1969 overhead cam six was certainly a unique engine in a number of aspects. Some people say, well, it's just a Chevrolet engine with a Pontiac head, but that's not entirely true. There were a number of differences, and we will speak about those in a second. But first, let's discuss a little bit of the environment in which this overhead cam six-cylinder engine came to life. Now, remember, who was Pontiac's general manager during this time frame? Well, in 1965, it became John DeLorean. But prior to 1965, DeLorean was actually Pontiac's chief engineer, a position that he assumed in 1961. And DeLorean really was kind of a whiz-bang engineer. There were a lot of innovations in the Pontiac stable that came about during this time frame. Remember, in 1961, the Pontiac Tempest was introduced, and it had kind of a clever half of a 389 cubic inch V8 as its standard engine. That 194.5 cubic inch four-cylinder engine was, well, certainly an interesting one. It was relatively reliable and durable. It was, honestly, kind of half of a V8 engine, ran down the same machining line. It did have some quirks. It was a very large four-cylinder without a balance shaft, so it did shake a little bit at some speeds, but by and large was not a bad engine overall. Now, the Tempest also had a couple other innovative features, like a transaxle positioned in the rear, the Tempest torque transmission, and it also had a rope-style flexible drive shaft that allowed it to have a lower floor. So the Tempest had quite a bit of interior room in it, despite the fact that it was a so-called senior compact, introduced alongside the Oldsmobile F85 as well as the Buick Special in 1961, and on the heels of the Corvair, which was introduced for the 1960 model year. But again, DeLorean worked on those vehicles as he was the chief engineer at the time, and he also worked on this overhead cam six-cylinder engine when he was the chief engineer before being promoted to general manager in 1965. Now, DeLorean was the overall chief engineer for Pontiac, meaning he had responsibility for not just the powertrain, but also for the chassis, the frame, the suspension system, the brakes, and the body overall, as well as ride and handling and things like that. But the chief engine engineer was a gentleman by the name of Malcolm McKellar. And during this time frame, there was a lot of experimentation that was happening at Pontiac, particularly with overhead cam engines. McKellar had been with Pontiac since 1937, and he was really the driving force behind the Super Duty program of the early 1960s. In fact, you often hear some Pontiac camshafts of the era referred to as McKellar cams with specific numbers because he and his team were the ones that developed them. Now, there were quite a few overhead cam V8s that McKellar and his team were floating around as potential production variants. Some even almost made it into cars. But the overhead cam six-cylinder engine was really the only one that ended up making it in the end. And as I mentioned before, it just made it for a few model years, 4 model years specifically, 1966, 67, 68, and 69. So let's discuss a little bit about the introduction of the overhead cam 6 in that 1966 model year. Remember around this time that in 1964, the A-body Tempest was re-engineered and introduced as a more, let's say, conventional car. The 61 to 63s were the ones with the slant four-cylinder as the standard equipment, the Tempest torque transaxle in the rear, the rope drive shaft. By 1964, they had become kind of conventional senior compact cars, front engine with rear drive and a front transmission, no rear axle anymore. The standard engine in 1964 was a 215 cubic inch overhead valve six-cylinder that was based on a Chevrolet design that had come out in 1962. Now, Pontiac did have a unique displacement. That 215 sat in the middle of the 194 cubic inch six-cylinder that came in Chevy 2s and a larger 230 cubic inch six-cylinder that came standard in full-size cars. But aside from just a slightly unique displacement, it was effectively a Chevrolet engine. And because it was slightly different, these engines actually have Pontiac cast into the side of the engine block, despite being based on a Chevrolet design. Now, when Pontiac decided to introduce the overhead cam six-cylinder engine, one of the things they went with was the 230 cubic inch Chevrolet six-cylinder as the baseline, as opposed to the unique displacement 215 cubic inch. And that probably led to even more rumors that this was effectively a Chevrolet six-cylinder with a Pontiac head. But that's not true, as I mentioned. There were differences in the block itself, including provisions for an in-block camshaft and valve train, as well as a lowered oil pan that helped provide increased block rigidity. And there was a provision for cross-bolted mains on this particular six-cylinder to provide enhanced lower-end rigidity, but that was actually never used in production. So the lower end of the engine was somewhat different, with obviously some similarities, like bore centers as an example, where in the same places, and the deck height was the same. So the lower end's a bit of a hybrid between Chevrolet with some unique Pontiac touches. And the bore and stroke on this particular six-cylinder engine that displaced 230 cubic inches was 3.875 inches for the bore and 3.25 inches of stroke. So an over-square design set up for, let's say, relatively higher revving success. And of course, to accompany the block that I mentioned, Pontiac engineers had to innovate with respect to a cylinder head as well as how the valve train would be actuated. Now, one of the things that they developed was a very interesting way to drive the overhead camshaft. And more specifically, I believe that this was the first instance, at least from a domestically produced car, that a belt was used to drive the overhead camshaft. Now, prior to this, there were overhead cam engines, but the cams were often driven by chains or shafts. But a belt wanted to be used in this, or Pontiac wanted a belt to be used in this case, really for ease of service and quietness of operation. You can imagine there was some initial apprehension to employing a belt, but they actually had great success. The belt was engineered to withstand 3,600 pounds of tensile strength, and it really was only under about 300 pounds of load. So there was a factor of 12 between what it was rated for and what it could actually withstand. And the belts actually ended up being very durable. The original tests of belts first had just plain rubber, and you can imagine that those didn't last very long. Then they tried some that were impregnated with steel, and those started to corrode and rust and fail. And that's when they came up with this idea for a fiberglass reinforced belt. And that really was the factor that enabled them to employ the overhead cam and have that driven by a belt. Now, beyond the innovativeness of the belt itself, one thing that was interesting was that the engine also had a separate housing that housed the distributor, the fuel pump, the oil pump, and the oil filter assembly. And this was driven by the belt as well, and it helped keep tension on the belt. So it had kind of an innovative accessory drive feature that also served another purpose, and that was to ensure the belt tension remained. Now, while some people think of overhead camshaft engines as being ultra-high revvers, this overhead cam six-cylinder engine really wasn't made to be a super high rever at the time. In fact, there was no variant of it that was produced from 1966 to 1969 that made peak horsepower over 5,400 RPM. 5,400 RPM was relatively high for the time frame. Most V8s, I would say conventional V8s, made their peak power in the high 4,000 RPM range, like 4,800 RPM. So this was 600 RPM above that, but it still wasn't crazy fast, like 7,000 RPM or anything like that. And that's in part because Pontiac decided to give the six-cylinder engine hydraulic lifters. And that was done, again, for ease of maintenance as well as smooth operation. There were no manual lash adjustments, and it really worked in this engine. This was not meant to be a race engine, but something that would give buyers good performance and way less than a V8, and it generally did that. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the variants of this six-cylinder now. When it was first introduced, the base variant of the overhead cam 6 had a single-barrel Rochester carburetor, just kind of a simple style exhaust manifold. It was 230 cubic inches, as I mentioned before, and was rated at 165 horsepower at 4,700 RPM and 216 pound-feet of torque at 2,600 RPM. Now, if you want to compare this to the Chevrolet 230 cubic inch overhead valve six-cylinder engine, this was 25 more horsepower and it was 4 pound-feet less of torque. So slightly less torque. Let's call it flat on the torque, but 25 more horsepower on a base of 140. That's not too shabby. Now, there were, of course, other variants of this overhead cam six-cylinder engine. And in 1966, you could get the Sprint 6 that came standard with Pontiac's first application of the quadrajet carburetor mounted perpendicular to the engine, with the secondaries kind of facing the engine, or closest to it, I should say. And the Sprint six-cylinder made 207 horsepower at 5,200 RPM and 228 pound-feet of torque. So going from 165 to 207 horsepower, that's a big deal, big jump, 42 horsepower more. And from basically an engine with the same displacement, the main difference was that there was a hotter camshaft as well as a higher compression ratio, now 10.5 to 1 in the Sprint six-cylinder. This engine was available as part of the Sprint package, and it was available in any Tempest, Tempest Custom, and LeMans, except for station wagons. You couldn't get it in your station wagons. And in addition to this engine, the Sprint package gave you a better suspension setup, stiffer shocks, a stiffer sway, or a bigger sway bar, I should say, and heavy-duty springs. You also got a series of badges on the car to denote that you had a Sprint six-cylinder engine. And it was a relatively peppy car for the time, kind of a GTO Junior, if you will. And Motor Trend tested a Tempest Sprint two-door hardtop back in January of 1966. That Sprint package cost $127, and then there was a $16 ride and handling package. When equipped with that engine and a 4-speed manual transmission, this Tempest went from 0 to 60 in 9.2 seconds and ran the quarter mile at 16.7 seconds at 82 miles per hour. So it was, for the time, decently fast. Remember that many intermediate cars weren't breaking 10 seconds, 0 to 60, and many full-size cars weren't either. So this was actually pretty peppy. If you want to compare it to a GTO with 389 cubic inch V8, those would run in the mid 7-second range with the 4-barrel carburetor and the high 6-second range, 0 to 60, with the tri-power option. So it was definitely no GTO, but it also wasn't a slouch. When 1967 rolled around, the base engine for 1967 was effectively the same 165 horsepower single-barrel carburetor 9-to-1 compression ratio engine from 1966, but the Sprint engine got a little bit more power, 215 horsepower for 1967 compared to 207 in 1966, and 240 pound-feet of torque compared to 228 pound-feet of torque in 1966. Again, breathing through a Rochester 4-barrel carburetor with 10.5 to 1 compression ratio, meaning you had to burn premium fuel. The interesting thing was that for 1967, you didn't have to get the Sprint package to get that 4-barrel carbureted 6-cylinder engine. You could actually get it on any Tempest, including the wagons. Now, while you could get it on the wagons, I believe that it was very limited in terms of its offering for 1967. Apparently 33 were made, 33 Tempest Safari wagons with the Sprint 6-cylinder engine. 8 were manual transmission vehicles, 25 were automatic. So if anybody knows where one of those 8 Tempest Sprint wagons is, that would be pretty sweet. But that was a paltry number. I believe Tempest Sprints for 1967, there were 17,661 that were made across the Firebird, which had 7,200. The LeMans had 5,500. The Tempest Custom had 3,800. And the base Tempest had 1,000 of these Tempest Sprint overhead cam engines. So pretty sweet little engine. I would love to have one in a Tempest Safari. That's awesome. And as you heard there, the overhead cam 6-cylinder engine was offered in the Pontiac that was introduced for 1967, the Firebird. So you could get that engine, you could get a 326, you could get a 400. Lots of engines available in your Firebird. I think the 6-cylinder would be a kind of cool one to have, a little Jaguar XKE type engine in your Firebird. But for 1968, the overhead cam 6 would get a little larger. It would go to 250 cubic inches, just like the Chevrolet overhead valve 6-cylinder. And now it had a undersquare design, the bore being 3.25 inches, the stroke being 3.53 inches. The base 250 cubic inch 6-cylinder was rated 175 horsepower and 240 pound-feet of torque. The Sprint version kept the 215 horsepower, but had a little bit more torque, now 255 pound-feet of torque as opposed to 240 pound-feet of torque in the previous year. But the hottest Tempest six-cylinder engine ever would be around for the last model year. And in this case, it was still 250 cubic inches, but there was a 230 horsepower variant. It made 230 horsepower at 5,400 RPM and 260 pound-feet of torque at 3,600 RPM, breathing through the Rochester 4-barrel 10.5 to 1 compression ratio with a relatively hot camshaft. So these six-cylinder engines came in up to 230 horsepower. Again, that was only offered for 1969. And then the least amount of horsepower they were available with was 165 horsepower, which was the base engine, or the base six-cylinder, I should say, for 1966 and 1967. So what happened? Why did this engine go away just after 4 model years in 1969? Well, you have to remember by this point, John DeLorean had moved on from Pontiac, and he was now the general manager of a larger division, namely Chevrolet. And there was a new person in his place, Jim McDonald, who would later become General Motors president. And one of the things that I believe was a factor here is that as opposed to engineering excellence, Jim McDonald was more interested in saving costs and improving the profitability of Pontiac Motor Division. You could kind of see that as time went on in 1970, 71, and 72. Some of the interiors in Pontiac started to become less sexy and used, let's say, not the greatest materials until you get a little bit of a rebirth of Pontiac in 1972 with the luxury LeMans, in 1973 with the Granville having an all-new interior and a more luxurious interior. But I would say some of those years for anything outside of the GTOs, like the 1970 model year is an example with those interestingly styled full-size vehicles from Pontiac is not one of my favorites. Although the cars are fun. The 455, only year premium fuel Pontiac 455 was 1970. So you definitely get a fast car if you get a 1970 Pontiac Bonneville or Catalina or an Executive, as an example, with that engine under hood. Nonetheless, I mentioned this six-cylinder would go away after 1969, and Pontiac would not produce its own overhead cam engine after this. So it was kind of a flash in the pan, one and done, and kind of marks also the end of innovative powertrain engineering at Pontiac. Yes, the Pontiac V8 did continue on for a number of years after this, the 455 through 1976. The Pontiac 400 would continue on a bit beyond that, and the last Pontiac engine, the 301 cubic inch V8, would continue on into the 1981 model year. Pontiac would even introduce a 265 cubic inch variant of its V8, but those were, I will just call them conventional designs. There wasn't much innovative about them. One could argue that the Super Duty Pontiac V8 maybe was the absolute last hurrah, but that was an overhead valve V8 engine, didn't have overhead cams, and didn't have really any quirks or charm points necessarily like the slant 4-cylinder. But I hope you enjoyed this discussion of the Pontiac overhead cam 6-cylinder engine. If you did, be sure to put a comment in the comment section. Did you have one of these even? What did you think about it? Write a comment or 2 or 3. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care.